What percent of people do you think literally believe that white people are a superior race and should run society due to that? So thank you for deciding to listen to this. I'd like to ask you one more thing. Just take some time and think about that initial question. What percent of people do you think literally believe that white people are a superior race and should run society due to that? This is a question that I've been thinking of for some time and a little more recently. And I just asked this on one of my social portals, and I shall be reading you some of the responses and conversations that happened under it. And I thank my friends and people for commenting and interacting with me on that. And also would like you to comment in whichever comment section you can, wherever you're listening to this from, or you can send me mails or whatever. I think problems occur not because of what X is, but because of how we define X. And what I have asked about there seems to be the definition of white supremacy. Like you'd say that people who think white people are a superior race and should run society due to it, and then somebody in Jeopardy or something in a show like that would say, what is white supremacy? I don't really know a definition of white supremacy that would not include this as a belief. And this is something that has increased in supposed threat. This has been something that President Joe Biden of the United States of America has recently come out and said is one of the major threats in the world. This is something that supposedly critical race theorists and other people are saying this is something that a lot of energy, time, and concentration needs to be put towards dealing with this. I am not a white person. I know white people. I deal with some white people. If there actually is this situation of white supremacy, I might be missing it, but I might be subject to it whether or not I'm aware of it or not. If there is somebody who thinks X group is actually just superior to all other groups and should somehow run the world, that's something that will affect me because I am part of this world. So I'd like to establish what people think the threat actually is. This is a belief that has practical applications. Even if you don't hold the belief, it doesn't take that many people to hold this belief and actually act on it for it to have effects on the world at large. So before I get into the definitions of white supremacy that I found a couple of sources and the actual comments that happened under me posting that initial question that I hope you've answered in your mind and have something in mind to see if it matches what the people said. I'd like to read a part of a speech that President Joe Biden gave recently at the commemoration of the massacre that occurred in Tulsa, Oklahoma, 100 years ago. So this speech was given, I think, on June 2nd. The article is from June 2nd. The speech might have been given, I think, on June 1st while he was at an event commemorating this. So this is from the article. Quote, while delivering his remarks to commemorate 100 years of the incident, Biden said, for much too long, the history of what took place here was told in silence, cloaked in darkness. But just because history is silent, it doesn't mean that it did not take place. And while darkness can hide much, it erases nothing. It erases nothing. Some injustices are so heinous, so horrific, so grievous, that they can't be buried no matter how hard people try, he added. Biden added that, according to the U.S. intelligence community, terrorism from white supremacy is the most lethal threat to the homeland today. Not ISIS, not Al-Qaeda, white supremacists. My administration will soon lay out a broader strategy to counter domestic terrorism and the violence driven by the most heinous hate crimes and other forms of bigotry, he said. And that's it from the article. I'll try to leave links below if you want to read more about that, and you can also find information about what happened here. White supremacy in general has been something that he's been talking about, Joe Biden and the Democrats have been talking about for quite some time. He said it's part of the reason that the January 6th riots occurred was white supremacy was part of that. Part of why Trump was in there is white supremacy was part of that. They're looking through the military to find who are the white supremacists, who are the people talking about this. So what is this white supremacy? Is it bigger than Al-Qaeda? Is it bigger than ISIS? Well, yeah, maybe if you actually look in the last 4 years during Trump's time as president, how many actual attacks from ISIS and Al-Qaeda were there? Even the last 200 or so days from Joe Biden, how many attacks were there? So maybe if that's the threat level they're saying, could that actually be accurate in a sense? But are they coming from avowed white supremacists? Like they've mentioned that something like the recent Parkland shooting, or relatively recent, a couple of years ago, the Parkland shooting that happened in Florida, where this teen, went to the school and he shot up the school, that was put down as white supremacist. The person came out and hasn't actually said there was anything in particular about white supremacy. He shot a lot of white people, so I don't know why that's considered it. The recent one in Atlanta, where somebody went to some massage parlors and shot some people, including some white people, that wasn't that put down as white supremacist, even though the person has come out and said it was more about his sexual proclivities and things like that rather than actual white supremacy. That's being put down. So what is this white supremacy that is supposedly a threat? Now, if it's identified as white supremacy, what is actually being considered white supremacy? But then once you identify what that is, what is the actual threat level that you have of that? Is this a situation where it's like, yeah, if you swim, you drown. So if I just don't get into the water, I don't really have a threat of drowning? Or is this a situation where it's like a tsunami is about to come, where you don't even have to be entering the water, it's just going to come and get you regardless of you actually being in the water? I think some of those things are kind of good to kind of understand and get an idea of where you stand on these actual threats that are out there. So here we go now with the definitions of white supremacists. I'm going to start at Merriam-Webster, and as I mentioned, problems occur not because of what X is, but because of how we define X. So when I think white supremacists, these are things that I agree as definition. In my mind, this is what I think of. Other people might think something else. You might think something else. Let me know if you think something else or if you disagree with these ones, or if what you're talking about is another thing. I wonder, why would you just call it another thing instead of using the terms that are already there? But let's just go with this. Okay, so white supremacist, noun. Definition of white supremacist. A person who believes that the white race is inherently superior to other races and that white people should have control over people of other races. Examples of white supremacists in a sentence. White supremacists were convicted of hate crimes. First known use of white supremacist, 1896, in the meaning defined above. Now that's 1896, so the terms can change. It is 100 years, and things like these do change. So I'm not going to say that it has to be that exactly, but that's what we have there. Okay, next, I'm going to go to Britannica. I'm going to read maybe the first paragraph or something. It's Encyclopedia Britannica. White supremacy. White supremacy, beliefs and ideas purporting natural superiority of the lighter-skinned or white human races over other racial groups. In contemporary usage, the term white supremacist has been used to describe some groups espousing ultranationalist, racist, or fascist doctrines. White supremacist groups often have relied on violence to achieve their goals. Then it goes in here about some of the history. You can check it out as I mentioned. There shall be links below, or whatever you're listening to this, or my blog rantathon.wordpress.com. Might end up actually buying that web address. I'm not quite sure yet what I'm doing, all that stuff. But you'll be able to find this, or just type in white supremacist Britannica on any search engine, and you'll be able to find more information from that source. Next, I'll go to the ADL, which is the Anti-Defamation League. This is more of an activist type group, so this might have more of what the contemporary usage of this is. It might be closer to that people might think it is, and sources shall be there below. You can find it for yourself. And this one, I'll read the entire paragraph that they have here, the entry for it. And this is under extremism, terrorism, and bigotry, white supremacy. White supremacy is a term used to characterize various belief systems, central to which are one or more of the following key tenets. 1. Whites should have dominance over people of other backgrounds, especially where they may coexist. 2. Whites should live by themselves in a white-only society. 3. White people have their own culture that is superior to other cultures. 4. White people are genetically superior to other people. As a full-fledged ideology, white supremacy is far more encompassing than simple racism or bigotry. Most white supremacists today further believe that the white race is in danger of extinction due to a rising flood of non-whites who are controlled and manipulated by Jews, and that imminent action is needed to save the white race. As you can see, that's rather varied. Now let's go back to Merriam-Webster for white supremacy. Before I was talking about white supremacist, now I'm talking about just white supremacy. Definition of white supremacy. The belief that the white race is inherently superior to other races and that white people should have control over people of other races. Example here, the alt-right is the reactionary conservative movement. It is characterized by an embrace of fascism, white supremacy, and misogyny. Now you see there, whether you agree with that or not, that characterization of the alt-right, there is something in there where they're talking about the fascism is different. That's where you're talking about the political applications of it. And when you go back to the ADL definition, they're saying it needs one or more of the following key tenets. Like if somebody just thinks white people should live by themselves in a white-only society, let's say you identify as a black person, and your claim is that black people should not have white people live among them. Black people should have black-only societies to live in and run and control. Is that a white supremacist statement? Because you're claiming that white people should be outside. By you excluding a group from your group, only black people should be here, you're excluding all those other groups. Are you actively saying all those other groups can't intermingle, or all those other groups just shouldn't deal with your group? Is that a black supremacist statement? I'm not quite sure if the ADL would agree that that was. Next part of the definition. 2. The social, economic, and political systems that collectively enable white people to maintain power over people of other races. Here's an example. William Kelly turned his considerable intellect and imagination to the question of what it is like to be white in this country, and what it is like for all Americans to live under the conditions of white supremacy. And that was by Catherine Schultz. And first known usage of white supremacy was 1924, as the meaning defined in Sense 1. Now, this is a thing that I think gets most of the issues. Some people think it's just the structure, the systemic structures that are in there. But I have lived in different countries in the world. I've lived in Europe, where it's majority white. I've lived in the United States of America, still majority white. Right now, I'm recording this from Nairobi, Kenya. There are many social structures that keep certain groups of people in positions of power over other groups. Like right now, one of the major tribes in Kenya is the Kikuyu tribe, and they had the first president of the country, Uhuru Kenyatta. And most of the presidents have been from the tribe of the Kikuyus. I wouldn't say every single Kikuyu is wealthy, but many of the wealthiest people in the country are Kikuyu. The current president of Kenya is Uhuru Kenyatta, who is the son of Jomo Kenyatta, who is the Kenyatta family. That's the first president of the country. It's kind of like the first president of the United States of America was like George Americano or something. I don't know. So Kenyatta is in there. I'm not quite sure exactly what it means in that sense, but they are also the wealthiest family. They own the most land in the country. It's massive tracts of land where you just like, okay, this is the Kenyatta family. These kind of structures that result in very many negative situations for the country. Would people claim that is some kind of legacy of white supremacy because maybe the colonialists came, like this post-colonial theory, the colonists came, and then while they were settled in Nairobi, Kenya, which is where the capital is, which is also where the majority of the Kikuyu tribe lived, they were dealing with the Kikuyu tribe, and then they gave them a kind of leg up on the other tribes, and they were able to become parts of the institution of power when Kenya got independence, and then now they took those things that the white supremacist structures that were in there over 50 years ago and maintain that, and now maintain some kind of white supremacist systems, but turned to the Kikuyu. Is that what somebody would claim? I'm not quite sure. Or is this just a system that just happens to have certain people in them? So when you look at certain areas in the United States of America that are predominantly black, and there's a certain class of black people that are doing much better, the political class, the illiterati class, are doing a lot better than the poor people in the place, poor white people, poor Asian people, poor whatever people. Is that a situation where that's a white supremacist structure holding these people down? Or is it just the nature of certain coercive structures that don't really follow things like the non-aggression principle, that have this monopoly on force, that in general, once certain people get that, they will use their own in-group preferences that most of us have, that almost all of us have to a certain extent, and do things that are beneficial for ourselves, the people we care for, and our in-groups, to the detriment of people in the outside groups. Is that something that's more accurate, or are they saying this is necessarily just white? So in this situation, if it's a system that happens to be being used by white people, who, whether or not they're defining it as they're doing this for white people, let's say they just happen to be white, their family just happens to be white, they happen to live around white people, date white people, marry white people, have white children, then it would seem to be that this is specifically something that's for white. So would they be against that structure itself if it wasn't white people in that structure? Or is the problem that it is white people and they personally are not white? Because in some cases, it's also white people complaining about this. So are they saying we are white supremacists and benefiting from this? And how often do they actually take away some of these benefits that they're supposedly getting for this? That's another question that I just don't really necessarily see. Now, one last definition before I get into the actual conversation that I had with my friends and the back and forth. And again, let me know what you think about these things that I've been discussing in whichever way you possibly can, wherever you listen to this. And thanks again for listening. Okay, so this is from Wikipedia. White supremacy. White supremacy, or white supremacism, is the belief that white people are superior to those of other races, and thus should dominate them. The belief favors the maintenance and defense of white power and privilege. White supremacy has roots in the now discredited doctrine of scientific racism and was a key justification for colonialism. It underlines a spectrum of contemporary movements, including neo-Confederates, neo-Nazism, and Christian identity. See, that's what I was talking about. That's probably why they would say that structures that are keeping places in Asia, keeping places in Africa down were white supremacists. They don't really go about how these same structures did exist and still exist in Europe and places that were part of why there were great wars, where it was millions of white people killing millions of other white people. Like, were the Nazis white supremacists? If you say yes, then why... What is the reasoning for something like Operation Barbarossa, where Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front of Russia just had just this 3-year-long just massacre of mostly whites on mostly whites, almost entirely whites on entirely whites? Yes, you can say there were some Jews in there. People might say, okay, these were not these Jewish white people or the Semites or things like that. But in general, this was Europe before this globalization with all this travel. It was majority people that today would be considered white people, killing majority people today that were considered white people in some of the most brutal ways possible. Being ran by countries that were mostly white people, voted for or supported by mostly white people. Raping, pillaging, just horrible things, just starvation, just the most brutal aspects of it. So this is in 1940s, 1930s. So this is after the idea of white supremacy was already there. Would they consider this to be part of white supremacists? But now they talk about, the neo-Nazism, Christian identity, the Confederates, those were white supremacists. So I'm not quite sure exactly to how people are defining these terms. And you see the mixes. But with all these different definitions, I think one thing that was definitely included there was that white people are superior to other races, and due to this, should dominate them. So I think one of the main things that's been included in all these different definitions of white supremacy is X is superior to A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way through to Z, and thus should dominate A, B, C, D, all the way through Z besides X. Like X should be on top of that. That is the kind of general thing of supremacy. I think when you say supremacy, that's it. So if you take the white out, whatever you put in X, just thinking it's supreme, thinking it's better is one thing. But then going into the whole aspect of, okay, I need this to actually dominate over the rest due to its superiority is a different kind of thing. That's the key part that, to me, I'm concerned about. And I'm wondering how many people, what percent of people do you actually think believe that? Not just believe that, we'll take that to begin with and now act on that. So that's what I had in mind when I put this initial question out there and wanted to see what other people would say just from this comment, this limited in those characters, and to see what they say from that. Now, when it comes to beliefs, if somebody has a personal belief, that's one thing. I'm kind of skeptical on how personal beliefs truly can be, because if something is a belief and it has no effect on your actual actions, then what is really the point of that belief? Like, if I believe like there's some aliens on Alpha Centauri Prime, but it doesn't really affect the way I don't look at Alpha Centauri Prime. I never actually try to find out, never actually try to like make like provisions in my life in case they actually get here, and they're never going to come here, we're never going to see them. That's a pointless belief to me and has no effect on me. But then if that's the case, and I'm like, okay, we need to find a way to get funding to do that, I need to buy like stores because I think they're going to storm the earth and take us over, that is now a belief that has more concern in the actual salience to the rest of the world. If you truly have a personal belief, and I think there's very few truly personal beliefs out there, then there's really not so much I can do or say or care about that. For example, if a female considers 6'5" tall brunette white males to be the superior male and thinks due to that should dominate her choices in who she dates, I might be interested in that person, but if I knew that about them, that would probably reduce my interest in them. But it's not on me to say somebody should change that. Like, that's a negative thing. It's a horrible thing for you to actually believe that. She has her preferences. She believes she's a 6'5" brunette male supremacist, and she thinks they should dominate relationships. Okay, but is she out there saying, okay, everybody, if somebody else wants to date me, she's stopping that person saying you really shouldn't date him. You should find yourself a 6'5" brunette man. Even if he suggests that to them, then I might have some interest and say, okay, I'm interested in this person. Why are you getting in our relationship? I tried to convince this person that she's attracted to me, and we have that. But now if she's going further and saying, okay, I'm going to use my military to make sure that nobody like Silas actually gets the date. It's only 6'5" brunette white males who are dating all the females. Now that gets to be an issue. So unless you're taking it to that level, I'm just like, okay, whatever. It's not too big a deal to me personally. Okay, so here we go with the actual conversations. The first comment is from somebody who comments regularly on the things that I post, and I appreciate them for that a lot. And their comment was, the percentage will vary by demographic. And this is something I did have in mind when I was asking this. I'm just leaving it open to see what people get from the actual question and what they focus on. So with this, yeah. Think about it this way. If a white person claims that white silence is violence, and it's up to white people are the ones who are most responsible to go out there and tear down these systems, that white people are the ones who have the privilege, have the ability to actually go out there and influence and change the reality of people of color in the world today. They're the ones in the power. Is that a white supremacist claim? They're saying white people have a superior ability, have a privilege, have this preferential position in society or as mentality, as humans, over these other people to have an effect on those other people's lives. Is that a white supremacist opinion? X is preferential to all these other things, so should be the one in charge of doing this over all these other things. Next comment was from somebody who might have a conversation with soon on different other topics, and they said 0. And my response to that was like, it's definitely higher than 0. Like, there's still fundamentalist identitarian racial groups, so it could be 0.x though, like to my percentage. It could be it could be decimal numbers of the actual thing, but I don't think it's not 0. They're still insisting that it's 0 because to them, they said those groups have no interest in ruling over or running the societies of other groups. This is the identitarians. And in my estimation of what I'm saying is, if somebody says I'm an exclusionist, I just want my own area, I want to be left alone with my people alone, I don't necessarily consider that to be a supremacist type of mentality. Yet, according to the ADL, that's one of the things, but all the other definitions that I showed did not have that pull thing where it's like, okay, if somebody just says, I want to have my own homestead and just leave there, and we happen to be the same race. What if it's a mixed race? We have a same ideology that we think we want to do, but we just want to be left alone to do that. How is that necessarily a supremacist type of thing? They might think we have the best way of doing things, but we don't want to make you do anything else in a different way. I don't necessarily consider that to be a supremacist type of thing. At least if it is, I don't consider it to be a negative supremacist. This whole X supremacy thing could just be a definition of a term. It doesn't necessarily have to have negativeness or positiveness. I think for a healthy lifestyle, I'm an exercise supremacist rather than lethargy supremacist. I'm a whole food supremacist when it comes to diets over a processed food supremacist. Because I think if you want to be healthy, you're going to have exercise in your life. You're going to prefer to have exercise in your life, prefer to have a better diet, a whole foods diet, a cleaner diet in your life is supreme to any other diet when you're trying to achieve health. So that's something that I would consider to be that, and I don't consider that to be a negative thing necessarily. So here I think there is a difference between like supremacy in that sense of dominating on people and discriminacy, democracy. I mean, even with democracy, it's kind of a thing where you vote and you choose, I want this over the other. Are people who voted for Biden supremacists? Because they think Biden was a superior candidate to Donald Trump and wanted Biden to rule over even people who supported Trump. Trump supporters are not as beneficial as Biden. So they're Biden supremacists, and they're like, yeah, we want Biden to rule over the Trump supporters. See, that's the kind of thing. Is that the thing? And in this comment section, this one individual might get into conversation with him, was talking about how he's equating democracy and capitalism, thinks they're both bad for the same reasons, and probably have some discussions of that. And with many things, we seem to disagree on certain statements that are made, and then when we actually get in the conversation, we realize that the problem is occurring again, not because of what X actually is, but because of how we're defining X. Like here, for example, he talked about identitarians, and I didn't have identitarians in mind because I know who identitarians are. I had that. And when I think white supremacists, I never consider an identitarian somebody who's saying, I just want to be left alone. I just want to be with my people. I don't consider that to be a supremacist in that sense, especially in the sense where that is a threat. Because when you're looking at the political threat, when President Joe Biden starts talking about this is a bigger threat than ISIS, this is a bigger threat than Al-Qaeda, that's a terrorist threat. And a terrorist is somebody who acts in a certain way to achieve a political goal. And that's a white supremacist. Their political goal is white supremacy, is white leadership, is spreading that to the rest of the world. So that's where they would have the terrorism. If they're just like, I'm leaving society, that's not a terrorism thing. If somebody's like, I just want to have my own caliphate in this little homestead that I have, that's not a big issue. But if somebody says, I want a global caliphate, now that is a Islam supremacist type of mentality, and they're trying to spread that Islam in a different sense. Now that is something that is negative to me. Now, the next comment was from somebody I think I'll mention. I'm okay with mentioning the person's name here. I think he has a YouTube channel. You can check it out for yourself. It's about wizardry and different things. I have some interesting back and forths with him in different comment sections. Some things I just decide I'm not. Some things we've discussed where we just disagree on certain definitions of what, let's say, truth is, what faith is, what religion is. So it's got to the point where with some topics, it's not agree to disagree, but it's at a point where I am confident that we disagree so strongly on certain key definitions of certain topics that it is not productive to actually engage on those things. And then, as I mentioned, it's not in a situation where I'm affecting his life directly. He's not demanding anything from me. I'm not demanding anything from him. So it's a situation where the personal belief we have at what these words mean doesn't really go too much further to actually just keep knocking heads off of that. Doesn't really achieve too much. But if it was a situation going forward in a project, then there might be a situation to actually hash that out. So anyway, he said, what percent of the world is or leans left? And that's your answer. And my response to this was like, yeah, there are people who subconsciously think this, but I'm wondering how many of these people, if you could convince them that there was no actual repercussions saying this, let's say they were just together by themselves in their groups, would they come out and admit that, yeah, we truly believe white people have a superior power over all these other races, and this is why we're demanding things from white people, and especially the white people, would they say, yes, we are part of that superior race? We are part of the people that power. I don't think they would. I think it would be a very small amount of them. And he responded to that. He said, like, they'll all admit it from my discussion if you don't say the trigger mind control words they are programmed with and just have them walk through their logic Socratically. So that's kind of what I was thinking. There has to be some premise to support certain things that are stated in critical race theory. Certain things that are being stated that the society needs to do, white people need to do for people of color. That implies that one does believe that white people have a superior political power in the current society and structure. Even if you admit that you say we live in a white supremacist structure, so if we do live in a dominant white supremacist structure, then by that structure existing, white people, it would have been created for white people to be able to exercise socio-political power a lot more effectively than anyone else. So that's a white supremacist statement. Whether you believe that's accurate or whether you believe that's positive, that's one thing. But for you to say, white people have to do these things. Specifically, white people have to do these things for people of color, give back reparations and things like that. It's not something that black people can do. White people have to stop oppressing, actively be anti-racist or whatnot. That is a thing that is stating that white people have this higher power and ability that non-white people do not have in order to do this. White people are the only ones specifically who can be racist. So they're the ones who have these extra abilities, extra social political abilities. That's something that has to be accepted, whether it's subconsciously or unconsciously. If you claim to actually believe this, I don't see how that doesn't work without that. Somebody else put 14%. I don't know if that's part of some kind of thing, like besides being X percent of the population, they do this. I don't really know that. And one of my good friends said, I can't say I know anyone who actually thinks this. And these are the kind of people that makes me want to ask this, because I know a lot of white people and they don't seem to think this about themselves. They don't really seem to think this about people around them. And this person in particular does live in an area where supposedly this is where these people have. She knows people that are avowed racists, who are racist in some situation, but there's a difference between racist and supremacist. If you have a racial, and again, there's also a difference between racial and racist. If you have a racial preference to certain things, like, oh, I'd prefer to listen to hip hop music by a black person because I think they would know more about that kind of music, it's more about part of their culture. That's a racial preference to your musical tastes. But is that racist? I don't necessarily think that it is. So having something that where you think you want some level of authenticity to something that involves somebody's race, or whatever valuation you think involves someone's race, could be racial, could be racist, could be supremacist, could also go to the point where it's segregationist. Segregationist is a little different. I just want these people put apart. People who say they get a bag of M&Ms or some Skittles and they just like certain color of Skittles and they say like, okay, I'm going to divide all the Skittles. I want the green Skittles together, the blue Skittles together, the brown Skittles. Is it brown Skittles? No, there's no brown Skittles. That's some M&Ms. But anyway, they want all those things divided into different. They don't want them mixed together. And then they say, okay, I prefer to start eating with the blue. Are they blue supremacists? Not necessarily. They just prefer the blue to be segregated. They prefer all the colors to be segregated and eat them in a certain order. But that doesn't necessarily make them a supremacist towards the one they want to eat first, because there's no kind of domination that they want from that color to have over the other colors. They're not out there actively advocating for M&M's company to say, like, stop making all the other color M&Ms. That's kind of a situation where I think most people are in that kind of situation. So I'm kind of wondering, what is the actual threat? Who are the people who are actively thinking we need to have programs and we need to enforce a situation where white people, by virtue of them being white, are the ones who run the affairs of everybody else in society? Because I think these other terms of saying they just want to be separate, there's other terms like separationist, segregationist, isolationist. So let's not use supremacy for something that already exists. There's other words, or you can invent a new word for these other terms that you mean. Now, the next comment, someone says, I think that even white identitarian racists like Richard Spencer don't really believe this. And then they ask, is my question directed primarily at America or the whole world? And in general, I had the idea, when I was forming this initial question, I was thinking of the leftists in the United States of America, wondering how many of them do you think actually are white supremacists? But I just thought the world in general, because this is something that is going more international. This is something that is not just the United States of America, not just Europe. But when you have the president of the United States of America talking about this on such a stage, other people talk about this. I hear people in other countries talking about these things. I see people liking things when they go on social media about white supremacy this, white supremacy that. Even in countries where, like in Kenya, I see some people commenting on things like this, where Kenya is about 46 million people. Less than 1% of that is white, and they still focus on this whole white supremacy thing. I'm just wondering, what is the actual threat that they have there? What's the actual thing that's in there? So I was saying people in general, but when I ask these kind of questions, I'm kind of interested to see what the people actually point out, and they think, okay, so most of my content is American focused. Most of my life has been in America. I've focused a lot on that, so a lot of the things are Amerocentric in this sense. So I do see that. And I was just asking this person, like, yeah, identitarians are more seclusionists than they are totalitarians. Now, I don't think you can be a white supremacist, black supremacist, Asian, Chinese, Han supremacist without being racist as well. So I do think that they are avowed racists who think this about whites consciously, where it's like, yes, I think whites should run it by virtue of being whites, like we are the superior race. And I was saying, okay, that's the kind of main thing I was trying to get at. And then somebody chimed in, whose comment will be following this, and they said, like, yeah, the feds. And I do think there are people in political positions of power when they have like hereditary type of things, like royalty and things. It was like kind of a genetic thing. Like, we are this genetic race, not even just the genetic race, but we are a specific group within this genetic race. We have God-given power to be the ones to run the world over these other peasants and the peons and things like that. So that does exist. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm just wondering, what's the percent of the people that actually think that? And there was a really good back and forth here. I think I might just try and read the whole thing between the person who had this comment and Stephen, who I've had separate conversations with. Stephen comes in and comments, and then like the person responds, and AIK is this person's name. So this is the initials of the name. I don't know if I can mention the person's name. But anyway, okay, here we go. So the answer to this, when I asked specific, I can't speak right now, but the specific people who do believe this, and then he said, okay, Yeah, most of this stuff is a distraction and it's lazy politics. The numbers of actual white supremacists is statistically very low, and they mainly dislike Jews more than blacks or other groups. And as far as people believing the federal government's assessment, I think people are gradually wising up and understanding that this is BS. Most of what's going on right now is just distracting from actual problems that need to be solved because politicians prefer to kick the can down the line for as long as possible. And then Stephen came in and, okay, AIC here is Jewish. I think, pretty sure he's Jewish. And you kind of mentioned that ADL type of thing, how there is a tie in here. And I think it was also mentioned in the Wikipedia thing, how there is a correlation with the white supremacists and anti-Semitism, specifically the Jews, because the Semites and Arabs and things like that is just Semitic people. It's not necessarily just the Jewish people, and also the Jewish people. It's also religion. So there's a lot of Jews in Africa who are Negroes when it comes to genetics. But anyway, so there is that aspect of it. So that definitely is in there. So Stephen comes in here and mentions. So he says, yeah, white nationalists make the point that they just want the separation of the races, not to rule others. To which AIK responds here, and he says, it's an old tale that has to do with an emergent empire having to balance its identity with the day-to-day management of a complex multi-ethnic nation, as well as the interests of its allies. America is what it is. It manages affairs all around the world that have insane implications for all other nations. Pretty much no one is confused about this outside of America. And here you can see why he was asking me if it's America-centric. And I think that is something that is key, maybe for me traveling around other places. And some people in Europe might be somewhat confused about this, but as I mentioned before, Europe, these people who are still alive, who lived through the world wars, who know this whole idea of this white race, this white kumbaya type of thing is not accurate. And that's why I think white and black are specifically American-centric terms. Like this whole idea of a white race is not something that exists in Europe. This whole idea of a black race is not something that exists in Africa. Even when people say Asians, and they don't say yellow in the United States of America, but when they say Asians, you go to Asia, that doesn't exist. You go to South America, there's no like Latinx and things like that. Really, there might be some Latinx and people like that identifying that way in the urban areas, which are pretty much interchangeable in most practical aspects and around the world in this globalized world that we live in, that monoculture type of thing that's developing in the urban-rural divide. But once you go into the rural divide and the places like that, you see very many differences between the peoples, where a Guatemalan in general would be kind of offended if you said they were Venezuelan. A Venezuelan, even when you go within the Venezuela, now within the actual places and now smaller divisions within those countries themselves, within those nationalities of the different ethnicities and cultures within there. So that's a thing that I think is something where there is something unique and exceptional about the United States of America being a society that was this massive with this many different cultures and ethnicities more rather than cultures. It's rather monocultural where these different ethnicities come in. For a while, they're balkanized within their own little communities, and due to different economic and practical relations that they have to just live together, they kind of coalesce and become part of this American culture. And that's something that is appealing to me. And I know this is a slogan. There's whole be all you can be, where it's like you go to the United States of America, and what can you be in the United States of America? You kind of figure that out. Rather, when other places, this is all that you can be. Someone goes and they says, okay, in X location, if someone is indigenous, they've lived here, this is all that you can be. If you're not this, then you're not part of this. If you're not Japan, if you go to Japan, if you're not Nipponese and you have that tradition, I can go in there and learn the language, be part of the culture, create parts of the culture, create art in their styles, know their history and things like that, marry into the people. But I would personally never be considered to be Japanese. There's something intrinsic about being Nipponese from that place, like Ainu or the different indigenous places that were in there that predated the country of Japan being founded, that in the form that exists today. These are central things that actually exist in certain places that are not necessarily the same in the United States of America. I think somebody from Japan can move to Japan in that one generation, in their own life, become accepted as part of the American people. And this is something that you'll see in the Olympics coming up. You'll see the most diverse, ethnically diverse groups of people that will be in there will be the United States of America. America, probably followed by Great Britain, probably followed by like France, and then maybe like some Arab states now that they've gotten a lot of people to move there for different like sporting things. And then from there, now it will be just divided kind of things that you'll see in different kind of places. Okay, now on to the next comment. This is one who mentioned the feds and the other one. So they said this: I think that if you truly understand and appreciate the underlying core values that Western Europeans espouse, you'll come to the conclusion that a truly European system doesn't wish harm or force on anyone for the color of their skin. I think honestly just a libertarianish America that resembles what we had in the 50s and 60s with equal rights for everyone is about the ideal white system. You put quotes on the white. It's just that the left is hyper-obsessed and focused on language and identity. This way they can draw up false narratives. If white people are so great at everything and rules have been bent and rearranged, then they will probably be just as good at treating other people with respect. My response to that, to get some more clarification on what they said, was as follows, and I mentioned some of these things before. I'm not certain how libertarianism and the 50s and 60s were, or if it can even be that way sans the other social issues, including some more of the overt systemic racism that existed back then. The words. Speak words. I am confident we are heading towards a more positive future, though. Critical race theory and other things are bad for sure, but World War II was in living memory. Karens may be a nuisance, but I'm not at risk of literally being lynched for sliding into a white woman's DMs like I would have been for the whim of someone in the 60s. Then I asked them, what percent of people do they actually believe that white people have some kind of genetic predisposition to actually running society better than anybody else, versus people who think that this is something that white people, due to various reasons, happen to have developed, that other people can learn and actually practice in their sense, or they can actually control these systems in a positive way, in the same, whether it's without white people being subjected to it, or in their own non-white societies, people of color communities, communities of color, whatever they want to do with that kind of situation. And they had a rather long response to it. I'll just go to some highlights of it. And they were just pointing out that they personally don't think it's an issue. And you look at the actual countries, very few countries that are predominantly any one genetic group or subsection of those groups, some tribe that has predominantly one tribe or something like that, has a situation where the leaders are part of a 13% or less minority. And you have a situation where Barack Obama, half or not, whatever you want to call him, was identified as a black president, and he was actually the leader of the United States of America, which is a majority white country. Can you find another country that has those kind of demographics with somebody who was identified as part of a less than 13% of the population, or less than 15%, let's just give it 50%, less than even 20% of the population group, happened to also be able to get the votes to actually run the nation? Now, in other situations where you've had some situations where somebody just becomes a strongman and runs the thing and becomes a kind of dictatorship, I think you might find situations like that. But in a situation where people who are not of this person's identified social in-group, racial or something, ethnic in-group, voted for this person to actually run the country, that's something that is rather specific to the United States of America, if not just Western countries, where you see people in Canada, people in positions of power in different countries in Western Europe who are not part of the majority ethnic group in those areas, founding ethnic groups of those nations. I think that is something that is rather particular to certain cultures and certain societies. He stated here that, this is a quote, "One of the biggest problems with white people, however, is that they can't say, yeah, we're good at that, because they were programmed into thinking that that was the next step on the ladder before the SS marches into your room and looks through your DMs." Now, slight disagreement on this one. As I've mentioned before, the wars are very true. I think in part it's because white people themselves don't really have that identity of white people. Many of the white people that he's talking about don't have an identity of white people anywhere as close to Americans, blacks, have that identity of black people. There is really no, for most people, they have their identity to their nationality. They say, like, we're Danish, we're Swedish, we're Scandinavian at most, we're Balkan at most, we're Slavs at most. But to go and say we're white, there's too many people. I think many of those people have grandparents who, even if they themselves have grown up in that white kind of term, they themselves grew up beyond the 18, where there was white supremacy, things like that. Those kind of terms come out where they were living in places where other white people, quote unquote white people, were regularly trying to kill them, were regularly trying to genocide them. So can you have a genocide within white people? Can they be blacks genociding other blacks? or because the definition of black as a group, you can't self-genocide. That's why I'm saying these terms are very specific. Because you look at the Rwandan genocide between the Hutus and the Tutsis. That's a genocide because they're separate groups. That was Hutu supremacists taking their belief further and in a genocidal way, killing off hundreds of thousands of Tutsis and many moderate Hutus and other people who just were caught up in that whole thing. That's a situation, that's separate things. When you look at Asia, when you had the rape of Nanking, there was a genocide going on in that place. That was the Japanese people coming in there and massacring a bunch of Chinese people. But then when you look at the Great Leap Forward in Mao's China, was that considered necessarily a genocide because there might have been different people in the different groups, or is that just the Chinese are kind of doing something because like the Han was different? When you look at the gulags, and you know, the Holodomor, was that a genocide because it's just white people? Can you say that was not genocide because it's just white people? Or do you say like, okay, this was the Soviets or the Russians targeting the Ukrainians and they consider themselves different groups and things like this? Or is it like the proletariat? Is it different social groups? Can you have genocides that are not necessarily defined by race, rather different kind of identities, different kind of groups? And yeah, I think you can. So that's why I'm kind of saying with some of these terms, it's not necessarily something that you can just say, okay, this is one group. These identity groups kind of don't exist in certain places, and that term white supremacist is something that is not necessarily that present outside of the United States of America with Europeans. But one of the benefits of the West is that you have this. And they said white privilege. One of the true white privileges that I think does exist is accountability, is the fact that we're going to talk about the things you did in history that are bad and remember them and try to make sure you never repeat these things again. Because that helps, that knowledge of saying this is a bad place we can go to if we do this is something I think is more positive than just not talking about it and saying, oh, we never did anything wrong, so we can just keep doing this and we will fall back into that authoritarian trap as well. Now, I think it's okay to be white. It's better not to care about being white. It's okay to be black. It's better not to care about being black, I think. These are things that you just happen to be. And I think it's not positive to put too much importance in things that just happen to be about how you were born. And we finished off with two more replies back and forth, and we both agree that we do have a general confidence that society is heading in a better way. There are going to be some rough times, but this is definitely nowhere close to things that have been as bad as they have been in living memory. So essentially, if there was a place like the 50s or 60s, as was mentioned by this person's comment, that was exactly like the United States of America is right now, technologically, but social-politically wise, was like America in the 50s and 60s. I would not choose to move there rather than move to the United States of America that I see right now. So that's kind of where I am on the actual issues with the social status of the place. The next person here had this comment. And they put different like numbers and things like that because I guess they think some things get tagged or not shown or something. I don't know. But they said whites are superior in body fat, but they average less intelligence than East Asians and Jews. So this to me is a really boring comment that comes up with identitarian and things like that. And I think this is the scientific racism that was mentioned in one of the definitions type of thing. They're talking about the bell curve or the IQ thing. And with this, I kind of have a question. With these IQ things, are they testing IQ based in the United States of America? So the Jews that you're testing, is it all Jews? Like as I mentioned, the Jews in Africa? Is it other Jews? Is it just the Ashkenazi Jews? And this is what? 15 million people in the world are Jews. That's the ones I think you'd consider genetically and historically and ethnically Jews. Compared to how many white people in the world? Are you only focusing on the white people in the United States of America that come from a stock of people that self-selected by leaving Europe to begin with? This is similar than when you look at the East Asians. If you're testing East Asians in the United States of America, these are people who decided to leave Asia on their own, go through whatever process that it is to actually travel and move, in cases from the past when it was a lot more difficult to actually move. And then once they got here, they had to do certain things in order to actually live in this country and be successful and not return. Like before they had the welfare state growing up and things like this, even Europeans, it was something like 75% or something like 70% of the people who actually immigrated to the United States of America end up moving back to their country of origin after like 5 years or so. So you have that kind of situation where they just weren't successful. So the ones who happen to be successful have self-selected themselves in a certain way where they already have certain things where they might not be the same as your average Han Chinese taking that IQ test is not necessarily the same as somebody who's like a third or second generation Chinese person here. They might be self-selecting for a certain different kind of mentality. So when you talk about the IQ things and that sense, I don't necessarily see the importance of this, especially when I'm talking about white supremacists here. And then there's also the added thing: if some of the white supremacists truly do believe this, oh, whites should be running society over blacks because we have the reason we do better is because we have better IQ. Yet many of them also admit, it's a helicopter you might be able to hear. Many of them also admit that, oh, we invented things like helicopters, we invented all these kind of things in society. And that is part of why we're doing better than black people, doing better than Latin people. We have the better IQs than them. But they will also admit that East Asians and Jews have a better higher IQ. And then they will also complain that, oh, that the Jews are running society. But it's like, didn't you admit that IQ supposedly gives you the well-being, explains why you run society? So why are you objecting to Jews who you admit have a higher IQ than whites in general running society? Shouldn't they also run it because they have? So that's the kind of thing that kind of goes into that situation that to me just doesn't necessarily make sense. I'm like, why are you even talking about this thing? What is the point of you bringing this up and this thing? And then when they talk about the fats, why is that why is that being something brought up? And I was thinking to myself like this is my whole thing. When I might think that dolphins in general are smarter than sharks, but I'm not a dolphin supremacist because I don't think dolphins should somehow like have the run of the ocean. No, the dolphins have their own dolphin community. The sharks have their own shark communities. Jellies and jellyfishes have their own shark community, their jelly communities. The turtles have their communities. The whales have their communities. They interact sometimes and have some kind of like little cycles of life that they go through in there. But just because a dolphin has whatever we identify as IQ higher than most other like mammals or creatures of the sea, I don't think dolphins should dominate the sea. So even if white people truly are on average, and from the studies that they've done, seem to be on average of higher IQ than people of color, families of color. It's a racist term, right? So it's a racially charged term, the people of color. Because I was a child and I remember watching Sarafina, which is a show about apartheid in South Africa, and they were calling people colored, and that's one of the things. And now people of color is kind of being brought back because current racist tactics are still the same as the old racist tactics, apparently. But anyway, so you have the situation with the white people have higher average IQ. I think if you actually accounted for parenting, which peaceful parenting is the way to go. And I think cultures that peaceful parent more have just kids that can function better. Even if somebody was found to have a top IQ of 90 points, but was peacefully parented versus somebody who had an IQ of 140 points, but was abused, was hit, was neglected, I think that 90 person might be more functional in society, might be a better person to deal with than that 140 person, because that could damage stuff. And then 140 person might be able to have might have been 155 if they weren't abused. Like you can maximize things by not abusing somebody. So I think that's one of the things to actually account for in these situations. But I just don't really see the importance. Yeah, so what? If somebody's more intelligent, sure, they might be more capable at something, doesn't mean they have to do that thing. Like, just because I'm physically stronger than the average person working in a warehouse doesn't mean I shouldn't be recording these videos or drawing and things like that. Like, I should be the one who's actually running all the warehouse lifting jobs. Like, that's just not how society works. I just find that to be kind of a pointless comment to actually just throw in here. Now, as we get towards the end of this, there's a friend who is regularly banned from social media and just happens to be on one of the stints where they're not banned, and they commented this: white culture or white skin? Skin, very few. Likely a handful at that. Culture, anyone can embrace Western cultural values regardless of ethnicity. But that is technically white culture, so anyone with common sense who's actually experienced other cultures. So in general, that's rather agreeable. And in my response, I was asking them, do they think socialism and communism, with their children of feminism, critical race theory, etc., are also part of white culture, even though I do believe that the West is the result of the best ways that humans have figured out how to live. And I asked them a few things, pointed out how, like, you go to Europe, there's Greeks who are Greek supremacists. You go to South Africa, there's Zulu supremacists who think these different groups are supposedly the best ways to actually do this. But then also when it comes down to the threat level, as I mentioned before, if you're like Joe Biden and comparing it and saying, okay, white supremacists pose a higher threat to the homeland in the United States of America in that sense, then do Al-Qaeda, then do the Taliban, then do ISIS and people like that, then technically is that accurate? Because as you mentioned, during the whole Trump time, how many actual Americans in the homeland were actually killed by people who claimed to be supporters and followers of that? So if that's the threat level, then how concerning is that? Is that America is so exceptional that that's the level of threat that people should be actually concentrating on? So, in the response, they talked about certain things about how they agree that the West is the best result of the way humans have lived, and talked about other positive things in other cultures. We talked about Japanese, Asian cultures, and things like that, different values that they have, talking about some historical things as well. Now, I know them to be culturally Jewish and also Eastern European of ethnicity. So I don't know if that's what you meant, that it was either from the Jews or from the Eastern Europeans where this came. But then, even when you talk about something like Christianity, yes, it did originate in the Bronze Age in the Middle East. But what we're dealing with in Western culture right now is something that has come from the Western traditional culture. So even when it comes to something like socialism, communism, even though it might have started, just the seeds of it might have started from outside Western culture, what we're seeing right now has grown up as part of Western culture. But there's a part in there that he talked about the downfall of Western culture was been the acceptance and kindness towards other cultures that don't share the same values. And with this particular thought, I suggest that people don't really hold on to this thought too much because, as I mentioned, the threat, what is the current threat level that we're actually dealing with here, that we're talking about here? From things like critical race theory, from actual feminism and things like this, from socialism and communism, compared to what happened in Mao's China, compared to what happened in the Soviet Union. Do people actually imagine that's going to happen now? Now, the Soviet Union and China have survived that level of communism, that level of socialism. Venezuela still exists as Venezuela. Do people think the United States of America is going to become anywhere close to Venezuela? I can't imagine it. I can imagine it, but it's hard for me to imagine it actually getting to that point. So those cultures have survived that. The United States of America is, first of all, we're living in a different timeline. The amount of information that we're sharing, the fact that I'm having the ability to record this and have this conversation, and have the people comment this way, changes the whole status of all these other cultures that happen to survive things that were a lot worse. We can survive. Society, humanity will survive the collectivism that's going on in the world today if we've survived the things in the past. The United States of America can survive what's going on with the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes, with President Joe Biden going talking about whatever level of threat that white supremacy is actually going to have the involvement there. They can survive that. The United States of America, Western culture, whatever you want to define that as, will survive this threat. It survived the Great Wars. It survived a lot worse. It's going to survive this and evolve and change into something else and become part of this human cultural, global culture and society that we're going to have. So I'm not necessarily too worried about that sense. And again, that's why I'm trying to establish what is the threat level that people, both people who think these people talking about white supremacy are crazy and they're going to destroy Western culture, we need to stop them. I'm concerned of how much do you think those people are a threat? How much energy should I be investing in combating that kind of messaging? And the people who claim that white supremacy is actually a threat, is going to destroy society, how much do they think I should be worried and wary of white supremacists messing with my life? And how much do they think society depends on them being stopped, the actual white supremacists? That's kind of what I'm trying to understand in this situation. And maybe I just don't really understand people in America literally mean figuratively even more than most people. So some people might be like, oh, it's literally the worst day of my life. But it's really not. So it's going to be, oh, like white supremacy is literally the worst threat in the world, but it's really not. Is that the kind of same status or sense that they're putting on these kind of things? Then a friend, my good friend's sister, posted and said, please don't put me in charge of anything or anyone. I can't handle it. And then just joking back, I was like, okay, it's white privilege that for you to be able to opt out of needing to be in charge of your life and community. Reported. And then snark aside, I was telling him, like, from the distance, I can see that she's doing a pretty good job of mothering her kids. And that I'm, again, confident that this whole claims of them actually being both white supremacists and that the danger over the people who are supposedly against these white supremacists is a lot bigger than we think. It's 24-hour media circle. It's outrage politics. It's just getting fodder at it. It seems like trolling, just throwing things, just to get people to click on things, get people all fired up when, as was mentioned before by a different comment, there's some distractions to the actual things. The second you find actual politicians of this level saying we need to focus on this, that just makes me super suspicious. That's why even when it's coming up with the whole lab leak theory that people are now talking about, oh, we can talk about that now, I'm like suspicious. Like, what's going on? Like, I already knew this information. I was already talking about it myself because I found it to be important. But now I'm suspect that you are telling me that this is something we should be talking about now. So I'm trying to wonder, why are they telling us to focus on white supremacy? What are we missing while they're telling us to focus on this? So that's the kind of situation. And then they just respond and they say they just try to do the best day to day, be a good person, teach their kids to be good people, and then hope that people don't take that offensively. And I think that's how most people are living, whether it's people in the United States of America, white people in the United States of America, black people in the United States of America, Hutus, Tutsis that still live today, like people back in the day, even people in Nazi Germany were probably just living in general thinking, I'm just going to teach my kids. There's other things that might be added to it. And now people are going to be like, you're calling the Nazis good people. No, I'm saying people in general do things that they consider to be good. Now, we should also define how good are these things. And that's where you go to the actual definition. The problems occur to how people define what is good. But in general, most people have this mentality. They say they just try to do their best every day, be a good person. If they have kids, teach their kids to be good people and hope they don't offend people. There's not too many people out there actively trying to offend people, actively trying to raise people that are going to be harmful to people. And I think in this situation, even take it further. If you do this, don't even hope people take it offensively. If people take it offensively, but you are confident your kids have been good, and you can find different objective things to show that your kids are good, you shouldn't even care. In fact, you should be glad when look at the people who are offended that what your good actions are, and see them. Are they good people? If those people are not good people, you shouldn't care about them being offended. If they don't necessarily have a direct influence in your day-to-day life, care even less, because people who are not up to no good, people who fail at certain things, people who are harmful, people who don't want certain best things or look at certain things in your life are going to be offended when you do certain positive things. There is an aspect of that I think is forgotten in this situation. And now here we go. 2 more comments to go. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much for listening, and thank these people for commenting again. And I'm glad that these people were able to share some thoughts with me and just have me be able to record these and get these thoughts and have these conversations and share it with you. And I'm hoping you're enjoying listening to this. And this has been something that maybe you've had people have these conversations in a similar way, but this just shows that these are conversations. And I mean, I could go in here and try to go to like different people with different backgrounds and ethnicities and places and mindsets that have come and commented on this. And there's a relatively wide range, but still, these are thoughts. We're all earthlings, we're all humans, we're all talking about these things. So this is the second to last comment. Around less than 2%, or equal to the percentage of actual transgender population in the United States, to believe that there is a phantom white supremacist boogeyman organization that is responsible for everything that goes awful in our society is a pretty high level of suspension of disbelief. But I am naive and want to support MAGA, so I'll go back to playing with my kazoo and wearing a fitted dunce cap. And that was my response to them was like, that's it. To actually believe it. To actually literally believe, as I mentioned at the start, to literally believe. What percent of people do you think literally believe that white people are a superior race and should run society due to that? People who literally believe that. I was thinking, like, at least 90% of the people who say they do believe this don't actually believe it. Then of the remaining that actually do, they're trying to find most of the people of the remaining who don't believe it, who just say it to say it. Some people just say things, oh, it's a good day. It's like I said, it's literally the worst day of my life. People who just say that. There's some people who truly have certain conditions or certain outlooks of life that they really might think when you hear them say this is the worst day of my life. Some things might have happened in their life that they think that. And there's different things in their life, like, is this actually worse than that other thing? Was it worse than that other thing? Or this is going to be the worst day of my life? They're looking at things in their life and comparing and contrasting to other things that are seen to actually have evidence, empirical evidence for it being the worst day of their life. But they're still not completely sold. They think they could have been a worse day in the past. They're not necessarily sure, or they're not necessarily sure the thing that they think is going to harm them in their life today will actually be a threat. But they're worried, they're concerned. There's actually things out there that might have been created, might have been boogeymen, might not be necessarily real. But even thinking a boogeyman exists, whether that boogeyman doesn't exist, because boogeymen in general are imaginary, they don't exist. But belief in a boogeyman is something. I'm talking about 90% of the people don't even believe in the boogeyman. They just say it because there's some kind of social benefit to saying it, some other perceived social benefit to actually saying it. So that's kind of how I think. So the actual people, last answer was just somebody who hasn't commented in a while. I'm glad they came and commented. Just all they did was less than 1%. I agree with this person. That's where I'm at. I think it's less than 1% of the world's population literally believes this. Of the world's population. And white people make up like 500 million. Whatever whichever definition you want to define as white people, which would have to be some kind of a European ethnicity level, would be a prerequisite for you to be white. Even if you want to count all the mixed race people, you want to count Obama into that, because you could say, let's say you remove all the mixed race, whatever. Let's say you even want to count all the mixed race people. I think it's at most 750 million people in the world would be considered white. If they even have like one drop. If you apply the one drop rule to whiteness, 750 million people in the world. Of that 750 million people, they're not the only ones who believe that, because you can also be non-white and still believe this. But out of the 9 million or 8 million, let me actually check the actual number. I'm going to pause and actually check the actual number. I went to worldmeters.com, and there's other websites that have these really cool kind of ticker things, just ongoing tickers that just show you the different figures that you want. And the world population at the time that I saved this, so I got this, actually, write this. World population is 7,874,823,129 people. Well, those people, okay, you're going to count on like all the people like kids and babies and things like that, of course. But so of that world population, I would say less than 78,748,231 million people. I said million already. People actually believe this. That's okay. It's less than that. So let's say you say it's half of that. It's like 30, I'm counting my math, it's garbage. It's like 38 million people. Now those 38 million people, how many of them are active believers, actually fundamentalists, to the point where this is a belief that they actually act on and live on? It's not just a situation of like, I just want my kids to date all white people and I ain't going to have them date nobody who ain't no white person. Okay, that kind of sucks. That sucks for a few people out there who may be attracted to their daughter. Their daughter might be attracted to somebody who's not a white person, and they might get into a situation where they themselves aren't as white supremacists as some of the family members, and they still have ties to your lived experience. You were raised in a certain way, you believe in a certain way, you have certain closeness to them, and certain other things you might value for them. You might disagree with their white supremacist views, but they still raised you, they still house you, they still care for you, there's still other things about their culture. You still want to appeal to them, you want them to approve the person you're dating. So you're in that situation, you found this person as a person of color, and you're like, okay, I can't date this person. My parents won't approve. And then there's somebody else who's still attractive, didn't appeal to you as much as this person, but still earns about the same, actually lives in the area you want to live in. You can just let this go, and then you move on to this other person, and then you have the approval of your parents and your family and community and things like that you value in different sense, and you still have a pretty decent guy that you're dating with. You never know, the person might still be decent. It's nothing against that person. So for those people in that relationship, that might be an unfortunate practical application of the actual situation, but how many of those people are actually going to affect me in that life? I have personally not known myself to be in that situation, but I might have a kid that has part of my ethnicity that still exists and meets a female and meets a male or whatever that is from a family that is a child of a white supremacist. That is something that I think will still exist. But how much energy should I put, or should you put, into trying to avoid and address these people, this less than 35 million people in the world? How many of these people who actually truly believe this are people at positions of power? Are people who can actually set up truly far-reaching policies that have an effect on over 35 million people, for example, where it's like one person sets a law, or a handful of people who happen to come together and have this belief that we should put white people in positions of power, or we should actually start instigating things to take down people we think are in positions of power due to white supremacy. How many of those people are actually affecting things? How much energy and time should be invested in trying to address that percentage of the population versus try to communicate with and deal with the vast majority, with the greater than the 99.9% of the population that I think are not white supremacists? Now that's a question to ask, because this is the things that we think of when we're currently living in this current pandemic. What was the threat level of the pandemic? What percent of the world was actually a threat for this to be considered something to shut down the world? When you talk about terrorism, how many actual terrorist attacks actually exist for that to be considered a threat? When you talk about gun violence, when you talk about assault, when you talk about sexism, when you talk about examples of racism, examples of hate crimes, what percent of that, when you talk about police violence and things like this, what percent of that is at a situation where you're saying, this is the percent out of the this percent of these same kind of actions, so we should focus on that as a threat, as a significant threat? And it's an actual question. If you're walking around and 364 days of the year, every time you hear a twig snap, it's just a twig falling from a tree. But that one time you hear it, it's a tiger and it eats your face. Saying, oh, because 364 days of the year, it wasn't an issue, so I'm not going to pay attention that 365th time, could end up with a tiger or some kind of saber-toothed tiger eating your face. So that's a threat to be aware of and constantly aware of at all times. So I get that. Even if it's less than, in that situation, I can't do the math. Went and checked the calculator on math.com. So that's, even if something is 0.273% of a threat of saber-toothed tiger eating your face, that is something to be concerned about. But now that we live in a society and a culture where saber-toothed tigers don't walk around in the same amount, for me to be thinking while walking around Nairobi that every time I hear a twig, there's a chance that it's a lion about to eat my face is not necessarily too accurate to the actual reality of the times that I'm living in and the location that I'm living in. It's just not something to be as worried about as it was 100 years ago, living in the same location. 1,000 years ago, living in the same location. So that's something I think we need to have in mind. Think about the context and the time and the place that you're actually dealing with certain things. Certain things, if white supremacy itself can be an actual threat. It's a negative thing it could be a completely negative thing to exist, applied for in a political status. But is that still the political reality that we live in? Do we still live in a time where a white supremacist could really take control? Anything supremacist, an ex-supremacist could take control of the wheels of power and truly create horrific situations, civilizational ending situations that we know of and have experienced? And if they can, why would this person be able to do this? What is the structure that these ex-supremacists would be able to control in order to do this? And do we still need that state structure to exist? Do we still need somebody to have the ability to control a state, a socio-political structure, in the point where they can take their ideology of supremacy and oppress millions of people, billions of people in that sense? Like, if we're living in a society where there's just generally people living in homes, we're living in this place, we've created situations where humans, I am a human supremacist in some kind of sense. I think humans are superior to other animals on the planet. I think humans are the superior earthlings in my estimation of the thing. So we have human supremacist communities and things like that, and we live in societies where we don't have lions and things like that walking around, wandering around. Like, I could just go out at night, and I just take a walk at night. We have lights on and things like this. I could take a walk without worrying about a lion eating my face. So if there happens to be someone in this human supremacist structure that decided, I'm going to keep some wild lions, and these wild lions are going to be what's maintaining my position in your human community. So they're just adding this unnecessary threat to a generally safe and conducive, civilized environment by adding these wild lions. And for some time, they're taking care of the lions. They make sure they're safe in these enclosures and they make sure they don't wander around. But then somebody else comes in and either they just stop caring about it, they just let whoever take care of the lions, not checking who's carrying them, or they're actively going out and chasing people down. Somebody pisses them off. Release the lions. And then they do something like that, and they release the lions, and the lions are running, and I'm just walking. They're being sent to, like, hunt down somebody they think needs to be actually, like, mauled by these lions. And the lion, like, sees me on the way and, like, mauls me too. And then, who should I really be afraid of in this situation? Should I object to the existence of lions? Or should I object to the people who are controlling the lions, the people who are defending their need to be an existence of this lion preserve in my completely human exclusionist, supremacist environment? I think that's the kind of situation where we should be more concerned. Not that lions exist, because lions exist and lions eat people's faces occasionally if they have the opportunity to do that and they're hungry and things like this. Supremacists exist. Racist people exist. But if somebody's just racist and they're living in some trailer in the woods somewhere, they don't really have the ability to affect my life. So I'm more concerned about the structures that give these bigoted people, these ists, and these other people with other just opinions and things influence over my life. I want to increase individuality, increase agency, increase people's ability to just live in a liberated kind of environment where other people's ideas and thoughts that you might not agree with do not directly affect you, and your thoughts and ideas that other people don't agree with do not directly affect them. I think that's a better kind of situation to live in. Let me know what you think about this white supremacy thing. Let me know what you think about this conversation. Let me know what you think about the threat. Did it change? What did you have in mind when you first heard the start of this kind of question towards the things that were discussed? What definitions of white supremacy do you have actually seen talked about? Do you think it should be taught more? Do you think it's something that's hidden? Do you think it's something not discussed? Do you think I'm overestimating it? Do you think I'm underestimating this? Let me know what you think. And if you're watching the video version of this, there will be some merchandise on the screen right now. You can go get that. It's the bestseller in that store that I have, the Thomas Sowell 3. These are 3 questions that economist Thomas Sowell asks people, and he says mostly for the people on the political left to kind of break down some ideas, and mostly economics when he's talking about this. But I think the whole world is economics. It's cost-benefit analysis of what you're going to do, what you're not going to do. And that's how the world works. It's financial economics, that's a specific thing. But economics is just about being economical about your activities and your actions. So here are the questions, and I'll just kind of put them in relation to this white supremacy thing. So compare it to what? So white supremacy is a threat. Compared to what? What other kinds of supremacies are there? What other kinds of threats actually exist? Should I be concerned more with white supremacy, like we mentioned with Joe Biden saying it, compared to Al-Qaeda? Okay, if you identify white supremacists, yes, it's a majority white country, so there's what percent of Muslims in the United States of America? So if there are people, that's just Muslims, and what percent of actual ISIS sympathizers or ISIS identifying people in the United States of America? It's a much smaller number than there actually are potential white supremacists. Even if you say whichever group of people, out of all Muslims, less than 1% will be that way. Out of all white people, less than 1% will be a white supremacist. And then out of that 1% of those groups, then you take 1% of those groups that actually have this belief will be people who actually go on whether or not it's FBI kind of related entrapment type of coerce type of thing. We're going to let you actually do this 6-week cycle type of thing. We're going to set you up to do these kind of things based on your belief system kind of thing. Those people, then there will be technically more people in the United States of America who will be more likely to do it based off of white supremacist ideas than something like Islam supremacists. So if you're saying that's the level of threat, then okay, I get it. But compare the level of threat to obesity, I'd say that's a bigger threat to actually people dying in the United States of America than white supremacy. By far, I think that would be one. Is there more people dying by white supremacy versus things like police brutality? I don't know how many people are actually tied to say this was done because of white supremacists. There's definitely more people, I think, being killed in the United States of America and the world in general due to the lack of peaceful parenting, due to being abused as children and then growing up and carrying on that abuse. So I think to me that's a much bigger threat. At what cost? Now that's another question. At what cost should we actually combat white supremacy, supposedly white supremacy? What is the amount of money, time, and influence needs to be put in that? And then on the inverse are the people who say, oh, we need to fight the people who are saying we need to be too concerned with what Biden is talking about white supremacy. I can't believe he's saying that he's going to destroy the West. Is the West really at threat because Joe Biden is saying white supremacy is the biggest threat? Is that really the cost of it? You're sending your kids to school and then your kids are being told that, and there is an effect in that. But people say, okay, but what else am I going to do with my kids? I'm going to send them to public school. What's the cost of you sending your kid there? Oh, yeah, you might have this quote-unquote free public education, this free state education, but what control do you have over what they're being taught? So what is the cost of you actually homeschooling your kids or finding other ways of teaching them versus sending them to these institutions where they're told these kind of things? And what is the cost of you focusing on what Joe Biden is doing with this versus other actual more practical things that might be being done in politics? And then what hard evidence do you have? Now, here's the central question. I couldn't find the hard evidence, but I also there's empirical evidence that people don't need empirical evidence to believe that they have empirical evidence for their actual beliefs. So in this situation, what's the hard evidence that with white supremacy, however you want to define it, what is the hard evidence that you have that those white supremacist institutions exist? Because once you define the thing, however you want to define the thing, you identify its effects because those are the things that other people can actually address. Those are the reasons that are going to convince other people. You don't just say this is something we need to discuss, we need a conversation. How long are we going to have a conversation? Yes, have the conversation, but when you bring me into it, let me know the actual practical actions that you want me to take. Just having a conversation about it, this has been an over-hour-long self-conversation that I've had with people, talking about other things that I've discussed with other people over a much longer time. We were talking about a lot of things, but to have actionable results from it, what are the actual evidential things where we can say, we identified this issue, we've defined it this kind of way, now this is what we need to do in order to address this issue, and then you go from there. And that's it for now. Thank you very much for listening. That was a Thomas Sowell 3. I said merchandise will be on the screen. I think it took a lot longer for me to actually record the thing. I don't know how long it's actually going to be on the screen for. But anyway, it should be on the screen right now because the last 2 minutes of most of the videos actually published, I put that on the screen if you're actually watching the video version. But this is just some of the way I think. I realize the way I think and approach things is not necessarily, it's not normal. It's not weird. It's a little unusual the way I approach things just from talking to other people and asking people certain questions and things like that. And I've self-selected a group of friends and people that actually think about things in different ways. And that's part of the way I have these conversations. And I want to share them out on these different platforms and places. And I'm sure there's other people who can think this because I don't think this is necessarily too high level, like super IQ type stuff. I don't think I have like some absurdly IQ level where I'm talking about things in certain ways that people won't be able to understand. No. But I'm also open to having these conversations, having you share these other things because I do think the actual issues out there. And I think part of the problems, as I mentioned, occur because of how we define X rather than what X is. And if we spend a lot of time focusing on things that are not really problems, that are problematic at best, we could be actually missing actual problems that could actually affect the many positive things about society and the much greater human flourishing that we can maintain and continue to and take steps to in the near future. So that's it for now. Like, share, subscribe wherever you listen to this. There's different sources. There'll be links below to my blog. I think I'll leave a main link for this actual thing posted that have links to other things and art and other projects that I'm doing. I have a lot of things in mind coming up. As the world opens up, I'm also opening up different things that I had in the back burner for some time. Looking forward to more of this content. Looking forward to hearing what you think about this. Till next time, goodbye.